In a quiet town surrounded by hills and winding streets lived a simple woman who never tried to be noticed. She worked at the local community center, cleaning floors, dusting chairs, and keeping the place tidy after events. Most people who came there barely looked at her. They greeted her politely at times, but no one ever stopped long enough to ask about her life. She didn't mind much. She was used to silence and simple routines. Every morning she walked the same path from her small rented room to the community center. She carried a little cloth bag with her lunch inside, usually a sandwich and a small apple. Life was calm, ordinary, and maybe even a little lonely, but she found peace in the small things. There was one thing, though, that made her eyes light up: the sound of music. Whenever she heard someone practicing the piano in the big hall, she would pause in her cleaning and listen quietly from the corner. She never interrupted. She never said anything. She just listened, her heart remembering something it once loved deeply. Long ago, before life became about surviving, she had dreamed of being a pianist. When she was younger, she spent hours playing on an old upright piano that belonged to a neighbor. She learned by watching others, by feeling the keys, by letting the sound tell her what was right and what was wrong. She had never gone to music school. She never had money for that. But she had heart, and that heart had once been full of melodies. Then, as it often happens, life got in the way. Her parents became ill, she had to work, and slowly the piano fell silent. Years passed, and she never touched one again. But every time she heard the sound of a piano, something inside her stirred. One Friday afternoon, the community center was busier than usual. A group of musicians had rented the hall to rehearse for a charity concert. They were lively and loud, laughing, chatting, and teasing each other as they carried instruments into the room. The woman as always quietly worked in the background. She swept the floor, picked up paper cups, and smiled kindly whenever someone passed by. The musicians barely noticed her except one who joked with his friends, "She's always here, isn't she? Maybe she can play better than us." They all laughed, not unkindly, but with the careless humor of people who think they're above others. One of them walked toward the old piano in the corner of the room. It had been sitting there for years, slightly out of tune, some keys chipped and yellowed. The man pressed a few notes, winced at the sound, and laughed. "This thing's practically broken," he said. Then, with a mischievous grin, he looked at the cleaning lady. "Hey, you, want to give it a try?" The room went quiet for a second, then everyone chuckled. It was meant as a harmless joke. They didn't expect her to take it seriously. The woman froze. Her broom paused in midair. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to do. She smiled awkwardly and shook her head, trying to brush it off. "Oh, no, I can't," she said softly. But the musicians urged her on. "Come on, just one note. This piano's broken anyway, we could use a good laugh." She felt her heart beat faster. Part of her wanted to walk away. She didn't like being the center of attention, and she knew they were joking. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the feeling of smooth ivory keys beneath her fingers, wanted to touch that piano again, even if just for a moment. Slowly, she put her broom aside. The laughter around her faded into curious silence. Everyone watched as she walked toward the piano. Her shoes made a soft sound on the wooden floor, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to wipe a thin layer of dust from the top. She looked at the keys. Some were chipped, some were uneven, but they were still there, like old friends waiting to be remembered. She sat down on the wooden bench, which creaked softly under her weight. Her hands hovered above the keys, and for a moment she simply closed her eyes. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the faint hum of the hall lights. And then she pressed one key. It made a dull sound, slightly off tune. She pressed another, then another. The sound was rough, imperfect, but it stirred something deep within her. The musicians snickered quietly, waiting for her to fumble. But instead, something unexpected happened. Her hands began to move with slow, graceful rhythm. The notes she played were soft, hesitant at first, but each one carried a feeling, a warmth that filled the empty hall. The broken piano responded like it remembered her too. The sounds, though imperfect, began to form a melody. The laughter stopped. No one spoke. They watched as the simple cleaning lady, the one they had barely noticed for months, began to play a tune that none of them had ever heard before. It wasn't loud or showy. It was gentle, emotional, like a whisper from the past. The woman's face changed as she played. Her expression softened. Her eyes closed again and a faint smile appeared on her lips. It was as if the world around her had disappeared. There were no musicians, no laughter, no cleaning jobs, just her and the piano, speaking a language only they understood. When she finished, the last note lingered in the air for a long moment before fading away. The hall was completely silent. The musicians stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The same man who had called her over looked down, embarrassed. That was amazing," he finally whispered. The woman smiled shyly and stood up. "It's just an old tune I used to play," she said quietly. One of the younger musicians asked, "Where did you learn that?" She shrugged lightly. "I used to play a little when I was younger. It's been a long time." No one could believe it. There was no sign of training, no sign of fame, just raw, heartfelt music from someone who had nothing to prove. She picked up her broom again, as if nothing had happened, and continued sweeping the floor. But the room didn't go back to normal. The musicians whispered to each other, replaying the moment in their minds. Later that evening, as the rehearsal ended, one of them came up to her. "Would you mind playing again tomorrow? For the sound test?" He asked carefully. She hesitated. "I don't know. I'm not really a performer," he smiled. "You should be." She laughed softly, almost like she didn't believe him. "No, I'm just someone who cleans the hall," she said, picking up her bag. When she left that night, the air outside was cool. She looked up at the stars and smiled quietly to herself. It had been years since she'd touched a piano, and now suddenly the music inside her had come alive again. Walking home, she thought about that broken piano. It wasn't perfect, just like her life, but somehow together they made something beautiful. That night she couldn't sleep. Her hands still tingled with the memory of the keys. She kept hearing the melody in her head. The way it filled the hall, the way it silenced the laughter. It all played again and again in her thoughts. She realized that even if the world had forgotten her dream had not forgotten her. It had been waiting quietly, hidden behind years of routine and silence, waiting for one small moment of courage. The next morning, she woke up early. Before heading to work, she stopped by a small cafe and ordered a cup of tea. As she sat by the window, she noticed people walking by, rushing to their jobs, their faces tired and distant. She wondered how many of them once had dreams they had left behind. At the community center, the same musicians were there again. When she entered, they greeted her differently this time. No teasing, no laughter, just a quiet respect. "Good morning," one of them said with a smile. "We were talking about you last night. You really surprised us." She blushed slightly and nodded. "I didn't mean to. I just felt like playing." One of them gestured toward the piano. "Would you play again?" "We fixed a few of the keys." She looked at the piano, unsure, but something inside her said yes. She walked over and sat down again. This time, when her fingers touched the keys, there was no hesitation. As she began to play, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, lighting up the room. The sound was still imperfect, but somehow that made it more beautiful. The people listening felt something they couldn't explain. It wasn't about technique or fame. It was about honesty, about life. And as the last note faded again, they clapped, not out of politeness, but from pure admiration. In that moment, the woman realized something powerful. She didn't need a perfect piano or a perfect life or even an audience. She only needed to play. And for the first time in many years, she felt alive again. The next day at the community center began like any other. The air smelled faintly of cleaning polish and coffee from the nearby vending machine. The woman arrived early, as always. She liked quiet mornings before the noise of the world began. It was her time to think, to breathe, to feel at peace before everyone else filled the space with their laughter and chatter. But today, her heart felt a little different. Something inside her was awake, something that had been asleep for years. She could still hear the sound of the old piano in her head, the way it came alive under her hands even though it was broken. She smiled faintly as she dusted the hallway, remembering the look on the musicians' faces when she had played. By late morning, the group of musicians returned for rehearsal. This time, when they saw her, they didn't joke or tease. One of them waved kindly. "Good morning," he said, and she smiled back, surprised by the change in tone. They were preparing for another long day of practice. Instruments were being tuned, cables stretched across the floor, microphones adjusted. The piano sat in the same corner, its worn-out wood catching the sunlight from the window. Someone had wiped it clean, and she noticed a few of the keys that were stuck yesterday now moved a little better. As she walked by, one of the musicians looked up and asked softly, "Would you play again before we start?" She hesitated. "Oh, I don't know if I should," but he smiled. "Please, it was special yesterday. Everyone's been talking about it." The others nodded in agreement. They weren't laughing this time. They seemed curious, even respectful. She could feel the warmth in their eyes. She wiped her hands on her apron nervously. "All right, maybe just for a minute." She sat down again on the bench. The same creak echoed beneath her, and her fingers rested gently on the keys. She took a deep breath as if steadying her heart and began to play. The first notes filled the room softly. Though the piano was still slightly off tune, the sound carried emotion that no tuning could fix. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. The music started slow, delicate, like a conversation between her and the instrument. Then it grew deeper, richer, more certain. The room grew still. Even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed to fade away. The musicians put down their instruments, watching in awe. Her hands moved with confidence now, as if the years of silence had never happened. The melody she played was different from yesterday's. It was brighter, hopeful, full of quiet strength. When she stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was the kind of silence that came when people were truly moved. One of the musicians finally said softly, "You really have something. You know that?" She laughed shyly, shaking her head. "I just play what I feel." They exchanged glances. The woman who cleaned their floors, who they had barely spoken to before, had somehow touched their hearts with nothing but a broken piano. After that, they insisted she stay for a while. Between their own rehearsals, they asked her questions. How long she had played, where she learned, what kind of music she loved. She answered gently, her voice humble, her words simple. She told them she used to play for her parents when she was young, that it had been her way to make them smile after long, tiring days. As she spoke, she realized she hadn't talked about her music in years. It felt strange, like revisiting a part of herself she had buried long ago. The day passed quickly. Before leaving, one of the younger musicians asked if he could record her playing. "Just for us," he said, "so we can remember this." She smiled and nodded. She didn't think much of it. To her, it was just a kind gesture. But that little moment would soon change everything. That evening, when she went home, she felt lighter. The street seemed more colorful, the air fresher. She carried a quiet joy in her heart. Music had returned to her life, even if, just for a while. She boiled some tea, sat by her small window, and looked out at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Across town, the musicians were still talking about her. The man who had recorded her couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. Her playing wasn't polished or trained, it was pure. He decided to post a small clip of her performance on social media with a simple caption, "The cleaning lady played our broken piano today," and left us speechless. He didn't expect much. He thought maybe a few people would find it touching. But by the next morning, the video had thousands of views. By afternoon, it had millions. People from all over the world commented. Some said her music made them cry. Others said it reminded them of their childhood or their dreams they had forgotten. The video was shared again and again. Meanwhile, the woman knew nothing of it. She arrived at the community center as usual, carrying her lunch and her soft smile. But when she walked in, everyone looked at her differently. The staff, the musicians, even strangers who had come to visit, all eyes turned to her. One of the staff members rushed up to her. "Do you know you're all over the internet?" She blinked, confused. "Me? What do you mean?" He showed her the video on his phone. There she was, sitting at the piano, her hands moving gently, her eyes closed, completely lost in music. The sound played softly through the phone speaker. She stared at it in disbelief. Her face turned a little red. "Oh no, people are watching this?" The musician who had posted it stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I should have asked. But people love it. They're moved by you. They want to know who you are." She didn't know what to say. For years she had been invisible, living quietly in the background, and now suddenly the world was looking at her. By evening, reporters started calling the community center. News outlets wanted to interview the mysterious woman who played the broken piano. Some even wanted her to perform at events. The attention made her nervous. She wasn't used to being noticed, let alone admired. "I just played for fun," she kept saying. "I'm not special." But deep down, she couldn't deny that something beautiful was happening. It wasn't about fame or attention, it was about connection. Her music had reached people she'd never met, touched hearts across oceans. A few days later, a local newspaper asked to do a short story on her. They took her picture beside the old piano and wrote about how her music reminded everyone that beauty can come from the simplest places. People in her town started recognizing her. Some smiled when they saw her in the market. Others stopped to say how much they loved her music. For the first time in many years, she felt like she mattered, but not everyone understood. A few people whispered behind her back, saying it was just luck that anyone could play like that. She heard them sometimes and smiled quietly. She wasn't angry. She knew life always had a mix of kindness and doubt. Still, every day after work, she went back to the piano. She played when no one was around, letting the notes fill the empty hall. Sometimes she played happy tunes, other times slow, emotional ones that carried pieces of her memories. The musicians often joined her, bringing their instruments. Together, they created small moments of joy that filled the community center with warmth. One evening, the man who managed the center came to her with a gentle smile. "Someone from a music foundation saw your video," he said. "They'd like to meet you. Maybe even help fix the piano properly." Her eyes widened. "Fix the piano?" "Yes," he said. "They said your story touched them. They want to restore it so others can hear you play again." She didn't know how to respond. Gratitude filled her heart so deeply she could barely speak. She nodded and whispered, "That would be wonderful." In the following days, the piano was carefully repaired. Technicians came, cleaned the inside, adjusted the strings, and tuned each note until it sang again. When they were done, the old piano looked and sounded new. When she sat down to play it for the first time after the repairs, the sound filled the hall with crystal-clear tones. The music seemed to dance in the air. People gathered around, listening quietly. Some had tears in their eyes. The woman smiled through her own tears. The same instrument that had once been broken, just like her forgotten dreams, now stood restored, alive again. And as she played, she thought about all the people who had listened, all the hearts that had felt her music. She didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment she was content. She wasn't just the woman who cleaned floors anymore. She was someone who had brought light into others' lives, not through wealth or fame, but through a simple melody played on a broken piano. And though she didn't realize it yet, her story was only beginning. Days passed, and life at the community center was no longer the same. What used to be a quiet building filled with music rehearsals and routine, chores had now become a place where visitors came hoping to meet the woman who played the broken piano. Every morning when she walked in with her small lunch bag and gentle smile, people greeted her warmly. Some waved, others simply nodded in respect. She was no longer invisible. And yet she stayed humble, quietly doing her work before sitting by the piano whenever she found a few free minutes. Her fingers moved naturally now. Each time she played, the room filled with calm and peace. Her music wasn't loud or complicated. It was pure and filled with emotion. People often said it made them feel like they were remembering something beautiful from their own lives. The piano, now fully repaired, sounded wonderful. The first time she played it after it was fixed, she couldn't stop smiling. The clear sound made her feel like she was speaking again after years of silence. The same piano that had once been a forgotten corner piece was now the heart of the hall. One afternoon, while she was cleaning, a young woman approached her. She was holding a camera. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I'm from a local TV station. We'd love to record your story. People have been talking about you everywhere. Would that be okay?" The woman looked surprised. "Oh, I don't know about that," she said softly. "I'm not used to cameras." The reporter smiled. "You don't have to perform. Just talk about your music. People want to hear from you." After some thought, she agreed. Later that week, they set up lights and microphones in the hall. She sat by the piano, her hands folded nervously in her lap. When the camera started rolling, she spoke slowly, her voice calm but full of honesty. "I never thought anyone would listen to me play again," she said. "I stopped for a long time. Life became busy and I thought that part of me was gone. But maybe dreams don't really die. They just wait quietly until you remember them. The reporter asked how it felt when the video of her playing went viral. She smiled shyly. It felt strange. I didn't expect people to care. I was just cleaning and they asked me to play. I didn't think it would mean anything to anyone. But maybe music finds people when they need it most. That short interview aired on television and spread even more widely online. People were touched by her sincerity. They saw not just a talented woman, but a kind soul who had never given up on something she loved even without realizing it. Soon, letters and messages began to arrive at the community center. Some were from children who said her story inspired them to learn piano. Others were from older people who said her music reminded them that it was never too late to start again. One evening, while reading a letter, she wiped a tear from her eye. It was from a little boy who had lost his mother. He wrote that her music made him feel like his mother was still with him. That letter stayed close to her heart. She kept it in her bag and read it whenever she felt unsure of herself. The center's manager noticed the growing attention and came to her one morning. "We've been invited to a charity concert in the city," he said. "They'd like you to play one song. It's a small event, but it could be something special." She froze. "Me? Play?" On stage, he nodded. "Yes. You don't have to if you're uncomfortable, but I think you should. People want to hear you." She looked at the piano, thinking about how this all began. As a joke, as a small moment that changed everything. She hesitated for a long time before finally whispering, "All right, I'll do it." The following days were a mix of excitement and nervousness. The musicians helped her prepare. They offered to accompany her with their instruments, but she decided to play alone. She said, "This piano was the one that gave me back my voice. I want to let it speak on its own." Every day after work, she practiced quietly in the hall. She didn't focus on perfection. She focused on feeling. Each note carried a piece of her story. Her struggles, her years of silence, her rediscovered joy. When the night of the concert finally arrived, she stood backstage, her hands trembling. The crowd on the other side of the curtain was larger than she had ever imagined. Bright lights shone on the stage. She could hear people chatting, laughing, waiting. For a moment, fear gripped her. She thought of turning back. She wasn't a performer. She was just an ordinary woman who had cleaned floors and played a broken piano one day. But then she remembered the boy's letter, the people who said her music gave them hope, and the piano that had waited years to sing again. When her name was called, the audience quieted. She walked slowly onto the stage, her steps small but steady. The grand piano stood in the middle, shining under the lights. She sat down, took a deep breath, and placed her hands on the keys. The first few notes echoed softly across the hall. The sound was warm, tender, and full of soul. The crowd listened silently. Her playing carried emotions that words could never express. She didn't look at the audience. She just played, lost in the music as if she were telling her life story through sound. The melody built slowly, then rose with quiet strength, like a memory being healed. Some people in the audience wiped away tears. Others closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. When she finished, the hall stayed silent for a heartbeat. Then came the sound of applause. Loud, endless applause that filled the air. People stood up, cheering, clapping, calling out her name. She looked up, overwhelmed. Tears welled in her eyes. She stood and bowed slightly, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you." After the concert, people lined up to meet her. Some hugged her. Others thanked her for reminding them that beauty can be found in the most ordinary places. She felt shy but happy. For the first time, she realized how deeply her music had touched others. That night, she went home and sat by her window again, looking at the stars just as she had on that first night she played the piano. Only this time, she didn't feel small or forgotten. She felt seen. Over the next few weeks, she received more invitations to play at local events. Schools, hospitals, and charities all wanted her to share her music. But she stayed true to herself. She didn't seek fame or money. She simply played for the joy of it, for the people who needed a little light in their lives. Sometimes she played for small crowds. Other times, for just one person sitting quietly in the corner of the hall. No matter how big or small the audience, she played with the same heart. The musicians who once joked with her now looked up to her. They often said she reminded them why they had started playing music in the first place, not for recognition, but for love. One day, as she was practicing alone, The same man who had teased her that first day walked in. He looked embarrassed but sincere. "I owe you an apology," he said softly. "We were rude. I didn't know you were such an amazing musician." She smiled gently. "It's all right. Maybe it happened for a reason. If you hadn't said anything that day, I might never have played again." He nodded, smiling in relief. "You changed the way I see things," he said quietly. Her days were still simple. She still cleaned, still cooked her small meals, still lived in her modest home, but her heart was full now. Music had given her back her sense of purpose, and with it came peace. Every evening before locking up the community center, she would sit at the piano one last time. She would play softly, letting the notes echo in the empty hall. The sound would drift through the open windows into the quiet streets outside. Sometimes people passing by would stop and listen. They didn't know who was playing, but they felt something beautiful in the air, something warm, familiar, and full of life. And though she didn't know what the future would bring, she was no longer afraid. She had learned that even in a world that often overlooks quiet souls, true talent and kindness always find their way to the light. Her journey had begun with laughter and doubt, but it had led her to something far greater, a second chance to live her dream, not for fame, but for love. And as long as there was a piano somewhere waiting to be played, she knew she would never be forgotten again. The days that followed her first big performance felt like something out of a dream. People from different towns began calling the community center, asking when she would play again. Some even visited just to see her in person, hoping to hear her music. It felt strange to her, being noticed after so many years of living quietly in the background. At first, she tried to keep everything as normal as possible. She still came early to work, cleaned the halls, and prepared the rooms for the day's activities. But now, every time she passed the piano, someone would ask her to play, and each time she did, more people would stop what they were doing to listen. The music that came from her hands carried something that words couldn't explain. It wasn't about skill or fame, it was about heart. Her playing made people pause and feel something they hadn't felt in a long time. Soon she started receiving letters from music schools and charities inviting her to perform. Some offered to pay her, but she always smiled and said she wasn't ready for that. "I don't play for money," she would say softly. "I play because it makes me feel alive." The community center staff admired her humility. They often told her that she had brought a new kind of warmth to the place. The once quiet building now buzzed with laughter, inspiration, and music. Even children who came for after-school programs would gather around her, watching her fingers move across the keys. One afternoon, a young girl approached her shyly after she finished playing. The girl's voice trembled as she said, "I want to learn piano too, but we can't afford lessons." The woman smiled kindly and said, "You can start right here. Come after school, and I'll teach you for free." From that day on, every evening after her cleaning duties, she would sit with the girl and show her how to play simple tunes. More children began joining them. Soon, the little corner near the piano became a small classroom filled with laughter and music. It wasn't long before a local journalist wrote another story about her, this time about how she was teaching children to play piano on her own time, expecting nothing in return. The story spread quickly. People called her the woman with the golden heart. The article reached even larger media networks. One day, the community center manager came running to her, waving a letter. "You've been invited to a national music event," he said, almost out of breath. She blinked in surprise. "Me? Why?" "They saw your story," he said with excitement. "They want you to play in front of professional musicians and guests from all over the country." Her heart began to race. The idea of standing on such a big stage scared her. She wasn't trained like the others would be. She had never learned to read complicated music sheets or perform under spotlights. "I'm not sure I belong there," she said softly. But the manager smiled. "You belong wherever your music takes you." After a few days of thinking, she decided to go. Not for fame, but to share her story, to remind people that dreams can live again no matter how long they've slept. When the day came, she traveled to the city with two of the musicians from the community center. It was the first time she had left her small town in years. The city was loud, full of tall buildings and shining lights. She looked out of the car window in awe, feeling both nervous and amazed. At the event, there were many famous musicians dressed in elegant clothes, carrying themselves with confidence. She felt out of place in her simple dress, but her calm smile never left her face. When it was finally her turn to perform, she walked slowly to the grand piano set in the middle of the stage. The lights were bright, the audience quiet. For a moment, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The melody she chose wasn't complicated. It was the same tune she had first played on the broken piano months ago. It carried emotion, pain, and beauty all at once. The audience listened in complete silence. Her fingers moved gracefully, each note telling a piece of her story, how she had been forgotten, how she had rediscovered her dream, and how music had healed her heart. When the last note faded, there was a moment of stillness. Then the applause began, soft at first, then stronger until the entire hall was standing. Some people even had tears in their eyes. She bowed her head slightly, overwhelmed. She had never imagined that something so simple could touch so many. After the event, journalists surrounded her asking questions. They wanted to know how she learned to play, how she felt standing on stage among professionals. She answered humbly, "I just play from my heart. I think music doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be honest." Her words spread quickly across social media and news channels. People were drawn to her sincerity. She became known as the humble pianist, the woman who reminded the world that true art lives in the soul, not in fame. In the weeks that followed, more opportunities came her way. Invitations to small concerts, charity events, and even television shows. But she stayed true to herself. She only accepted the ones that helped others. She played in hospitals for patients who couldn't leave their beds. She performed in old age homes, where the elderly closed their eyes and smiled at the familiar melodies. She visited schools and told children that dreams have no age limit. Each place she visited left her heart a little fuller. People hugged her, thanked her, and shared their own stories of lost dreams and second chances. Despite all the attention, she never changed. She still lived in her small home, still walked to the community center every morning, and still smiled at everyone she met. She never forgot where she came from or how everything had begun, with a broken piano and a moment of courage. One evening, after another long day, she sat alone in the empty hall. The lights were dim, the building quiet. She rested her hands on the piano and whispered softly, "Thank you." She played a gentle tune, one that only the walls and stars could hear. The sound drifted out through the open windows, carried by the cool night breeze. Outside, a passerby stopped, listening. Then another. Soon, a small group stood outside, not knowing who was playing but feeling the warmth in every note. Inside, the woman smiled to herself. She didn't need crowds or applause. These quiet, honest moments, were enough. Over time, the story of her life spread far and wide. People spoke of her as a reminder that miracles can start from the simplest acts. Some said she was proof that kindness and humility still mattered in a noisy world. And though her life had changed, her heart remained the same. She still loved small things: a cup of tea, the sound of rain on the windows, the laughter of children learning to play. One day, the community center received a special gift, a brand new piano donated by a music company. They sent a letter saying it was in honor of her story, which had inspired so many. When she saw the piano, tears filled her eyes. She ran her fingers over the smooth keys, remembering how it all began. With that broken instrument no one cared about, she smiled and said quietly, "I'll never forget you," glancing toward the old piano still sitting in the corner. The manager noticed her and said, "You know, we kept the old one just for you." She laughed softly. "It was never just an old piano," she said. "It was my first friend." From that day on, she often switched between both pianos, the new one that symbolized her new beginning and the old one that carried her past. As the sun set each evening, she played while children gathered around, listening closely, their faces glowing with curiosity and admiration. Her music filled the room, wrapping everyone in warmth and hope. Her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. But deep down she remained the same gentle soul who had once been told to play a broken piano as a joke. And instead of feeling bitterness, she felt gratitude, because that one small moment had brought her here, to a place where she could share her heart with the world. As she finished playing one evening, a young man who had just heard her for the first time said, "Your music feels like it's telling me that everything's going to be okay." She smiled softly. "Maybe it is," she said, "because that's what music did for me. And with that, she turned back to the piano, her fingers finding their way across the keys again, playing a melody that would live in people's hearts long after the sound faded away. The day she had quietly dreamed about for so long finally arrived. She had been invited to perform at a grand charity concert in the city, a real stage, lights, and an audience of hundreds. Though she had already played in smaller events and even on television, this felt different. It wasn't just the size or the crowd. It was the sense that this was a moment she would never forget, a culmination of everything she had lived through. When she woke that morning, the sun was warm on her face, but she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. She dressed carefully in a simple, elegant outfit, something that made her feel confident but still true to herself. She ate a light breakfast, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea into her cup. This was not a performance she had ever imagined herself doing, but somehow it felt right. At the community center, the musicians who had accompanied her in earlier events were waiting. They had all been there when her talent first surprised them, when the broken piano had sung under her hands and they had grown to respect her deeply. Today they were smiling, offering encouraging words. "You'll do wonderfully," one of them said softly. "Just play like you always do from your heart." She nodded, trying to calm her nerves. She had learned over the past months that her strength came from honesty and emotion, not perfection. Still, the weight of the stage and the audience made her hands feel heavy. The journey to the city was quiet. She looked out the car window at buildings rising like giants, streets filled with people and lights that seemed to touch the sky. She thought about her hometown, her small room, the quiet mornings, and the broken piano that had given her a second chance. The memory made her heart beat faster, but it also gave her courage. When they arrived at the concert hall, it was even more magnificent than she had imagined. The stage was grand, the lights bright, and the seats stretched far back into darkness. Musicians in formal attire moved about, tuning instruments and preparing for the evening. Backstage, she sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap. She could hear the murmur of the audience settling in, the rustle of programs, the quiet clearing of throats. She felt small in the grand space, but she reminded herself of everything she had gone through to reach this moment. She had played on a broken piano for laughter, for curiosity, and somehow, that had brought her here. When her name was called, she rose slowly. She took a deep breath and walked to the grand piano waiting at the center of the stage. The lights focused on her, and for a moment the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. She sat down, feeling the weight of the bench beneath her, the coolness of the polished keys under her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered the first time she had played on that broken piano. The laughter, the doubt, the hesitation, and then the music that had poured out from somewhere deep inside her. She remembered the children she had taught, the letters she had received, and the people whose hearts she had touched. Each memory added courage to her hands and calm to her mind. Her fingers rested gently on the keys and she began to play. The notes were soft at first, floating into the hall like a gentle whisper. Then they grew, carrying warmth, hope, and the quiet strength of someone who had lived through doubt and emerged with a song in her heart. The audience listened in silence, captivated by the emotion in every note. She wasn't trying to impress them with speed or complexity. She was telling her story, every chord a word, every melody a sentence. The music spoke of loss, of patience, of rediscovered joy, and of a dream that had waited quietly for years. As she continued, she could feel the hall responding. People leaned forward in their seats. Tears glistened on cheeks, and some closed their eyes, letting the music take them somewhere they had forgotten. Children in the front row sat wide-eyed, imagining a world where dreams could always come true. She didn't look at anyone in particular. She didn't need to. The music itself was enough. It was alive, carrying everything she had held inside for years. The broken piano of her past, the simple life she had led, the moments of doubt and courage, all of it flowed through her fingers and into the air. When she reached the final notes, the hall fell into a heartbeat of silence. Then slowly, applause began. It started softly, then grew louder until it filled every corner of the room. People stood, clapping, cheering, some even calling out words of admiration and thanks. She opened her eyes, tears brimming. She had never imagined a sound like this greeting her. It wasn't just applause. It was a recognition of her journey, of the courage it had taken to keep playing, and of the beauty that had emerged from her quiet life. She stood, bowed deeply and whispered, "Thank you," her voice trembling but steady. The audience cheered even more, their excitement and gratitude wrapping around her like a warm embrace. After the concert, she was approached by musicians, organizers, and even strangers who wanted to meet her. Some thanked her for sharing her music. Others told her how it had reminded them of their own dreams. Many said her story had given them hope. She listened to each person quietly, offering a gentle smile, a kind word, and sometimes a soft laugh. The reporters arrived too, asking questions she had not expected. "How does it feel to play on such a stage?" one asked. She thought for a moment and replied honestly, "I feel grateful. Music has always been a part of me, even when I thought it was gone. Tonight I realized that sometimes even the smallest moments can lead to something beautiful." Another reporter asked if she had plans to pursue music professionally. She shook her head gently. "I don't play for fame. I play because it fills my heart and touches others. That is enough for me." The audience that had come to see her perform left with something more than music. They carried her story with them, a story of patience, humility, courage, and the quiet persistence of a dream that never truly dies. As she walked backstage after the concert, the musicians from her hometown waited with hugs and congratulations. "You were incredible," one of them said softly. "We knew you had it, but this was beyond anything we imagined." She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I just played from my heart," she replied. Later that night, back in her small home, she sat by the window and gazed at the city lights. She thought about the journey she had traveled, from the broken piano in her hometown, to the laughter and doubt of the musicians, to the letters, the children, the television interviews, and finally to this grand stage. She felt a deep sense of peace. Her life had changed in ways she had never dreamed possible, but she had not changed herself. She still appreciated the small joys: tea in the morning, the quiet streets of her town, the smile of a child learning their first tune. And yet, she had discovered a power within herself she never knew existed, the power to touch hearts with nothing but honesty and music. She remembered the first time she had been told to play the broken piano as a joke. She had hesitated, almost walked away, and yet she had chosen to play. That one choice had led her here. She realized then that life's miracles often come disguised as small, ordinary moments. The next morning, she returned to her hometown and the community center. The piano she had played all those months was waiting for her. She ran her fingers over the keys, now smooth and perfect, but she never forgot the rough, imperfect keys that had first given her courage. Children gathered around, as they always did, eager to learn. She began to teach them again, sharing her music, her story, and most importantly, the belief that dreams, no matter how long forgotten, could always find a way back. The musicians from her hometown often visited to play with her. Together, they created small concerts for the neighborhood, bringing music and joy to everyone who came. People would stop in the streets to listen, some with tears, others smiling, and all of them feeling a little lighter because of the music. Over time, her story spread further and further. People from all over the country wrote to her, shared her videos, and told her how she had inspired them. And yet she remained the same gentle, humble woman who had once quietly cleaned floors in a small community center. Her life was simple, but it was full. She had discovered that fulfillment did not come from fame, but from sharing what she loved, from touching the lives of others, and from embracing every moment with honesty and heart. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit alone at the piano. The room was quiet, the streets silent, and the city asleep. She would play softly, the notes drifting into the darkness, carrying her story, her gratitude, and her joy. And in those moments, she felt completely alive. She had taken a broken piano, a quiet life, and a simple dream, and transformed them into something extraordinary. She had astonished the world not because she sought attention, but because she had followed her heart. And in doing so, she had shown everyone who listened that beauty, courage, and dreams could be found even in the most ordinary places. She smiled, her fingers resting on the final note, and whispered to herself, "Thank you for letting me play." And with that, she began to play once more, the music flowing freely, filling hearts, inspiring hope, and reminding everyone that sometimes The simplest acts carry the greatest power.